Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining the Tyler Wren webinar. And we're really fortunate to have both Laurie Kubiak, he's the CEO of NZIER. He's got about 20 or so economists working for him on a range of projects across NZ. We are also really lucky to have Bryan Whitefield here. Bryan's been consulting in NZ since about 1994 across risk management, strategy and decision making. He's also an author of a book, Winning Conversations, Turning Red Tape into Blue Ribbon, which you'll actually have an opportunity to get your hands on at some point after this webinar. So Laurie, I'll just pass over to you.
Oh, thank you, Lisa, and welcome everybody. It's really good to be here, and welcome also to Bryan. It's good to have some input into this from across the ditch as well. And the topic that you're about to speak on is, I think, both very interesting and very challenging in the time that we're moving into at the moment. Lisa has asked me to pass on some thoughts about what the next few months and the next couple of years are likely to look like, and I'm basing most of my remarks around something that we do at NZIER, the Institute of Economic Research, which is quarterly predictions. There it is. Came out the week before last, so it's hot off the press. It's a regular quarterly offering that we do, and obviously this time got an enormous amount of interest, as it was the first one since the lockdown. And it's one of the many, I would say, contributions to what does the recovery path out of COVID look like. So the direction of all those things, I mean, the other document I might be referring to is a thing we also do called consensus forecast, which is something that tries to take, a line through all the different views and arrive at a consensus. But our view is a bit different to the Treasury view or the Reserve Bank view in the detail, but the direction is pretty much the same as the other things that you will probably have seen on the media waves over the last few weeks. So what's going to happen? Well, the three-word answer is we will recover. And it's important to bear that in mind, because there are two schools of extremist thought at the moment. The first is we've just entered the zombie apocalypse, and there are going to be piles of corpses in the streets, economically speaking. We're going to go back to the Great Depression of the 1920s and 1930s. Things will never be the same again, and they'll be worse. Or there are people at the other end of the scale who say this was just a blip, and as soon as everybody's back at work, things are going to continue regardless, and we'll be storming on into a brave new future in which everything is bright and rosy. There's actually truth in both of those, but if you were to take a middle course between them, which is what I intend to do by saying that we will recover, it would look something like this. So we will recover because we need to think of what this pandemic is like as an economic phenomenon. And it's not actually the disease that caused the problems for us. It was the way that we responded to the disease. And that sounds like a trivial point, but it's actually really important. If you think of the great catastrophes of the past, if you think of the cholera epidemic of 1863 or Spanish flu in 1918, 1990, or indeed the global financial crisis of barely 10 years ago, those were things which we were powerless to resist. So in the case of the first two, those took enormous numbers of working age people out of the workforce because they had the flu or cholera. In the case of the global financial crisis, we were powerless in view of what had happened in the financial sector in the United States, which then rippled through the world. Now, we could have actually ignored COVID, but we chose a certain response, a certain reaction to the threat that was confronting us. And it's our response that actually determines the economics of the recovery. So it's actually all about the lockdown. It's the lockdown that causes the economic woes, not actually the disease. So what happened was the government decided we're going to go for a lockdown, and that is a decision to drastically and artificially reduce the productivity of the supply side of the economy. So let's take the labor market first of all. So if we compare it to cholera, working age people died. Here, no working age people died. But we decided to make them all stay at home and not work and not be productive. in broad terms. There are exceptions, of course. So we decided just not to have that part of the economy productive for a certain period of time. And it's that that's caused our difficulties, not the disease itself. We decided to take a certain path. So we will recover, but we will recover unevenly, and it will be some time before we get to the sort of strong levels of economic activity that we've been used to over the last few years. Now, the headline figure, the headline metric for is your economy doing well or badly is obviously GDP growth. And here in New Zealand, we've been running at 3 to 4% per year for the last, just under a decade or so. It's come off a bit in the last couple of years. It was down to 1.8% last year, I think, for March years, and about 2.8 before that. But 3 to 4% is good. That's a really good number. You know, your rule of thumb for economic growth in a developed economy is kind of 2.5 to 3%, and we were tracking above that. Normally, you know, once a nation is tracking above 4%, you know, people would say it's either a windfall or maybe you're Papua New Guinea and you just don't realize it. You know, those kinds of high levels of economic growth are associated with people who have a lower starting point. So we were going really well. Now, if I pick up the quarterly predictions and just read the figure off the page, at the end of this March year, so by March 2021, we are predicting GDP growth of negative 7.1%. So that's a big fall from both the 3-ish% that you'd expect in a normal developed economy and the 3 to 4% that we were experiencing here in New Zealand. So we're going to find that hard. So where is that fall going to come from? Well, I said that the recovery would be uneven just now, and some of the points of unevenness are very obvious to point at. I mean, the great example, obviously, is tourism. And that's one that we probably couldn't have done anything about because there we are reacting to international forces. But tourism was, it was roughly, I think, 8%. It was certainly 8.4% of the New Zealand workforce. And a lot of those people now have nothing to do. And again, if I look at the unemployment number for March next year, again, it's tracking around the -8% mark. So there are going to be big job losses, probably in the latter part of this year and the early part of next year. So a lot of people are going to get some very unpleasant Christmas presents. So tourism is an obvious direct effect, and any business that relies on shipping people around for obvious reasons is going to find it hard. So tourism, tertiary education, certain sectors of agriculture and horticulture, for example, that rely very heavily on migrant labor will be finding it hard in the year ahead of us. The other big sector that's going to be suffering is retail and hospitality, and it's easy to forget that those people are actually in some difficulty, a lot of them beforehand, for two main reasons. The first is the competition from online for a lot of them, and the second is the rises in the minimum wage, which hit those sectors harder than many other sectors. So retailers were already doing it hard, and so were people who work in hospo. So you layer the COVID thing on top of that, and it's looking very bleak for those people. So an uneven recovery. Now, some of those people can go and work in other sectors, but many won't. And the big thing that I really wanted to zero in on, apart from those obvious direct effects of COVID, is the effect on confidence, because this is something that really isn't talked about a great deal by the No, I'm back. Sorry, so my screen went a little weird. Yeah, so business confidence first of all. So we've been carrying out a survey of business confidence, of business opinion, since 1961, called the Quarterly Survey of Business Opinion. It's actually the second longest time series of business data in the world. The only one that's longer is the German one we stole it from, which started in 1959. So the QSBO the latest one, again, it's a quarterly thing that we do, came out just before lockdown, and already there given business confidence was well down and had been tracking down for the previous 2 years, and it was a net 67% of businesses that were expecting conditions to deteriorate in the future, COVID or not. So irrespective of what the plague might do, they were expecting things to be harder for them. So business confidence was not great before we went into this thing, and the events of the last few months won't have done a great deal to help it. The obvious rejoinder to that is, okay, well, what about the shovel-ready projects? Aren't we going to be spending an awful lot of money in these shovel-ready projects in infrastructure? And that's terrific, actually. That's really good, because that's a very good thing that the government can do and stimulate, and it's great to see them doing it. Particularly as one thing that we've observed since the lockdown period is a lot of those plans, which you can measure by things like consents that are granted around commercial development, have just been mothballed indefinitely. So the sort of demand that we were expecting to see for construction services, for example, 6 months ago, just isn't there at the moment from the private sector. So it's very good, actually, that the government is stepping in and soaking up some of that demand and keeping people employed. So business confidence, not flash before we went into this thing, definitely not flash now. Consumer confidence also has taken a dent, though. And we see this in a number of ways. First of all, people are obviously very, very cautious, because for them, for many people, the future is uncertain. If they are confident that they have a job 6 months from now themselves, they will know people who don't have that level of confidence, and they've faced rising prices. I had a look just before I came on this call on food price inflation across years. It's actually 4.4%. So across years. So if you've been going to the supermarket in the last few weeks and thinking it's costing you more than it used to, you're absolutely right. It is. And the reason for that seems to be some choke points, some constraints within the supply chain to get the stuff onto the supermarket shelves. So people face an uncertain future. Their food prices are going up. Yes, there are things like the wage subsidy there to help them, but they have a limited shelf life. The whole thing runs out on September the 1st. And in those circumstances, people don't open their wallets. And the government certainly was banking on early in the COVID response, by putting money into people's pockets, that they would spend more of it, and the whole sort of consumer system would keep going. And that didn't really happen. People sat on the cash that they had because the future was uncertain. When we look at the forecasts, we see that as well. We don't see that changing anytime soon, and certainly not this side of the earlier part of next year, because as I mentioned just now, the just over 8% job losses that we're expecting to see in the economy will be concentrated around the turn of this year and next. So confidence is not great. The other big thing that I'm looking at the clock, and I think I should probably close soon, but I'm wanting to focus on the things that aren't really being talked about a great deal, and that's what's happened in our fiscal and monetary world. So to fund the commitments that the government has made to make, payments to invest in a post-COVID future, we've borrowed nearly $60 billion. Essentially, we've printed through quantitative easing $60 billion, and that's doubling our GDP to debt ratio. So we're going to be we've got slightly different numbers to Treasury, but I'm looking at them now. So we think our gross core crown debt percentage of GDP in 2024 is north of 80%. Now the Treasury number is lower, I should say. In fairness, it's about 54% at 2023. That's because the Treasury modelling banks on a stronger increase in productivity and higher consumer spending, higher stimulus from that than we do. We think their assumptions around productivity are a little bit optimistic, but in a way, the number doesn't matter. It's the direction that matters. We're not going to be doing less than doubling our GDP, our debt as a proportion of GDP. What does this mean? It means that the money that the government has is printing at the moment, has been borrowing from the future taxpayer. In essence, money is a promise to pay, and what they've done is they said you can have this money now to go into these projects and to pay wage subsidies and to do all the things that we need to do to respond to COVID, but that's all underwritten by the future taxpayer. That's all guaranteed by the future taxpayer. Now, no tax increases have been announced yet, as I understand it, but I think we can confidently expect that they will come, because something will have to give, and this is not really being talked about at the moment, but I think this whole question here about, what we've actually done to the shape of our economy, the biggest shift is in the fiscal sector and around government spending. Another little indicator, so I looked at the what's called Obigal in the trade. Hate to talk dirty, but Obigal is the difference between the Crown expenses and Crown revenues, a sort of Crown profit, you can think of it, or Crown surplus. And that's not actually going to be in surplus on the government's own projections until, I think, 2027, 2028. Sorry, those are our projections. The government's a year or two earlier, but even if we take theirs, that's a long time to be working through a deficit and funding that deficit through printing money and borrowing. So that tax burden is going to fall on all of us, but disproportionately on those at the lower end of the income scale, who have fewer safety nets and will find it harder to pay. So it's not going to be an enjoyable time for them or us in the years to come. But I'll end on a cheerful note before we go to questions and to Bryan. We will recover. Remember what I said at the beginning. The great thing about the fact that we did this to ourselves is the productive capacity of the economy hasn't been destroyed. It's all still there. The workforce is intact. There are still people who can go out into the world, and they can move assets from a lower valued use to a higher valued use and create value that way. They can still do jobs. They can still run the services that we need. They can still work in export industries and earn hard currency for us. None of the ability to do that has actually been destroyed over the last couple of months. But some businesses in some sectors have been harmed very, 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 very badly. And it's the ripple-on effects of those particular harms that we're having to work through at the moment. But we will recover. It won't be as strong as it is now for several more years, and it'll be spotty. Some regions will do better than others, and some industries will do better than others, but we will come out of this. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Great. Sorry, Bryan. Just prior to moving across to you, we just want to remind our audience that there is an opportunity to ask questions. So if you do want to do that, then feel free. And we have got a few questions at the end that have been sent to us prior. So over to you, Bryan. Thanks.
Before Bryan speaks, sorry, forgive me, could I point out that I spoke for exactly the 20 minutes you told me to speak for, to the second.
Laurie, gold star for you.
Now put me on mute.
Well done, Laurie. Thanks very much. And thank you all for taking some time to listen to what I've got to say. It's been a pleasure to be invited to speak across the ditch using the modern technology that has made this whole COVID thing much different than it would have been 5, 10, and especially 20 years ago. Adaptive leadership. I wanted to talk to you about that. And it's something that it's not mine. It's something that came from a Harvard Business Review article by some people out of Harvard, Ronald Heitfitz and Marty Linsky. They coined the term, and they've been teaching adaptive leadership. But where it got prominence, their book got published in 2011, was an article in 2009 post the GFC. And so this came to my attention in this period. Very early on in this period, and I realised that that's what we were doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our leadership style, particularly managing uncertainty pre-crisis, what we were doing peak crisis, and then what we're doing now, which is adaptive leadership. So in terms of prior to the crisis, we're in BAU, having a wonderful time. As Laurie indicated, having some good growth. Over here, we've been impacted by bushfires and things, but things have been pretty good up until then. And so when things started coming on the airwaves about the virus that might have been happening in China, we were sort of ignorant to it. And then, of course, when it sort of escalated a bit, we ended in a bit of a denial phase. And that denial phase was because, well, that's over there. It's not here. But then we have what I refer to as our WTF moment. And the WTF moment was when things were starting to get real bad in Italy. Then we had, and so people started to move. I could see amongst my clients base that people were starting to say, well, what if they're standing up crisis management committee? So up until then, we were operating what I call risk leadership, which is standard risk management practice, strategic plans, strategic risks, operating plans, operating risks, and getting on with things. When we, so the WTF moment, people started making preparations. And then we had what I call the WTF exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark moment, when it really hit the fan. And pretty soon New Zealand's in lockdown and we're doing our version of our lockdown and people are scrambling. And that is full on peak leadership was crisis leadership, crisis management. And that's what we did for a period of time. And in terms of people in my game, we're small business. Most clients were busy getting their people out of the office and getting them set up at home, and certainly support them mentally, but they didn't need services like mine. So there was that complete shutdown for a while. But as soon as people realised, wait a second, this is going to be for a long time. I'm actually okay, and our business is going okay. Well, what are we going to do now? And that was when what I call an inflection point, or what was an inflection point. And it was an inflection point for three types of businesses: those that were failing, those that were surviving, and those that were thriving. So groceries thriving, some in the medical sector thriving. But everyone in that from that inflection point on entered a period of adaptive leadership. They were adapting on the run. So what I want to do now is I want to screen share and give you my take on what adaptive leadership is, based on the work of Heifetz et al. Okay, so let me start with a little bit of a drawing here. And I did say to everyone that my drawing is atrocious, and it is, but hey, we'll just have to deal with it as best we can. And another one. Okay. So the first thing that we need to be in adaptive leadership is we need to be courageous. And that means we need to have some critical conversations with people. We have to listen to voices that we don't normally listen to. This was the big thing that happened and still has to happen. Your leadership teams, you and your leadership teams haven't lived through one of these before. So what makes you the experts? So sometimes it's those people you weren't listening to before that you're going to listen to now. And of course, you've got to take some risks, particularly if you're in the heading down that failing curve. Okay, so it is about courageous conversations. It's about sacred cows, nothing sacred anymore. And I think we got plenty of stories through COVID of some of those. And then it's active experimentation. I won't explore that. Active experimentation. And what that means is you pick the things, your biggest problems, you design some experiments, and then you act on them. Now, one thing that I've seen with a lot of organisations is that they've thought that they've been experimenting by trying 5 or 6 things at once. And when something worked, they sort of said, well, it was this and this. And science doesn't work like that. Scientific experiments are very, very clear. I keep everything steady and vary one variable. And so the trick to this is to be experimenting on things coming forward. And I'll get to the bit about what's coming forward and why we still need to be experimenting. We need to experiment quickly by keeping variables firm and only varying one, but going quick on it. and taking a risk that you haven't had enough data, but enough data is enough data under these circumstances. Make a decision and act. And then it comes to the very important part of devolved decision making. Now, this fortunately happened in spades, obviously, when things went quite hairy and things had to operate from home. But we still got to maintain that. We can't draw back to ourselves as a senior leadership team and be a bottleneck. We've got to continue to allow people to experiment for themselves and take some risks themselves. Now, there's an element to this about what it is we're going to be courageous about. Oh, even I can't tolerate that writing. Oh, that's not moving. What we're going to be courageous about, when we're going to be courageous, and who we're going to let be courageous, who we're going to let experiment, and who are we going to let decide. So let me just draw one last thing up for you. Normally, when I talk, oops, I've got a button on my jacket that's just done a bit of drawing. This one again is from a paper, this time in the Journal of Business Strategy some years ago. And this one is about strategy over 3 time horizons, okay? And the 3 time horizons for strategy generally are, 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5, 6 to 30, depending. Defence Force has 30-year white papers. Not too many of us think 30 years out. And in terms of what we think about in these phases, this is about executing strategy. This is about planning. And this is about imagining the future. Okay. And then when I talk about it from a risk perspective, these are our operational risks and how we handle them. These are strategic, and these are emerging. And we put the two together, strategy and risk are 2 sides of the same coin. We progress well, and we plan for the future, and we move and keep track along those lines. Here's the big problem. These things here are no longer years. These are months. You are needing to execute by month. Your planning has got to be 3 to 5 months out, and you've got to be thinking 6 to 30 months out, not 6 to 30 years for your emerging. And so what I suggest to people is that they get themselves some scenarios. So scenario planning is the key. And you should be planning with a scenario on the downside at somewhere in that 6 month to 30 month, something on the upside, and there's one in between, and then do something similar here and here. So the first thing you need to do is scenario planning. I'm going to stop screen sharing now and then talk a little bit more to your faces. So scenario planning, and those are the key ones around the good, the bad, and the in-between, out at the 6 to 30 month range and the 3 to 5 month range. So you need about 6 scenarios. And those scenarios have to be based on things like what your assumptions are on what the government's going to do, what consumers are going to do, like Laurie mentioned. Will they hold on to their cash? Will they spend? You've got to do all these things. And then the next thing you do in adaptive leadership, you will do experimentation to test on your assumptions. How can I get more confident about things? Can I survey my customer base to get an idea of how they're going to respond? Those sorts of things. And then we go into the very last thing. I call it design thinking. It's actually about strategy, right? It's about what's the strategy I'm going to take. So what you've got to choose is what orientation of my organization is best suited for the 6 scenarios that I've just looked at. Now, obviously, there's some that'll be more likely than others, so you've got to look at likelihood. But once you've got a view, you're going to say, right, given these 6 scenarios, how should I orientate my future strategy for my business? And so that then comes into whether it's business model transformation, or is it just some design thinking around innovation on how we do things, or is it merger and acquisition? You know, it could be any number of things. But it's about being confident in your strategy rather than being pessimistic. Be confident in your strategy because you're saying to yourself, hey, I can see of all these scenarios, the good, the bad, the ugly. I can see that if I orientate this way, we can get there. And as long as you believe you've got the capability in your organization to do it, you can move forward with confidence. You move forward with confidence. It's like Laurie was saying, people will take action. And that action is what we needed while thinking long term. That's what I wanted to talk about today. I hope you found that interesting. And I think we're going to head to Q&A now.
Thanks, Bryan. Thanks for that. Thanks, Laurie. So we've got a couple of questions that have come through for the guys, and I think we'll kick off with the first one of Laurie, if you don't mind. So this one, would commodities, oil comes to mind here, still have a further push in a negative direction? Although travel restrictions have halted transportation and countries are seeing a halt in trade routes, could commodities be on a rebound in the near future, or do you see it struggling until the COVID restrictions are minimal?
Probably they've all been down over the last few months, and indeed the last year, haven't they? Pretty much all commodity prices, with the exceptions of 1 or 2 foodstuffs. What's going to happen going forward? Well, I guess you're seeing the delivery chains of those things adjust. So, you know, when the oil price turned negative a couple of months back, you know, so that was really about a readjustment of the, you know, the stocks that that the producers were holding of oil. Look, I'm not giving investment advice. I should say that up front, but I think.
Disclaimer there, don't worry.
Yeah, I think probably not a great deal. I mean, where I think the money is going at the moment, and what we're actually observing on markets, is they're going to equities. That's certainly happening in New Zealand, and I think also in Australia. You know, when COVID crashed a lot of stuff, then I think you know, lots of equities became good buys. They were looking a lot cheaper than they were beforehand, and we're also living in a time of really cheap money, right? So interest rates are super low at the moment. So if you're looking for growth potential and you've got the availability to credit or the cash to do it, you're probably going to be looking for good buys in the equity space. There's also a question of the sort of, you know, short versus long term here. So if the trend we're looking at on commodities is the last 12 months, it looks pretty safe that, you know, the gold, for example, has been on a general march upwards since actually well before the global financial crisis. And so it's off where it was a year ago, let's say, but compared to where it was in, say, 2000, it's looking pretty healthy. So you know, what's your long-term risk? But will commodities rebound? No, I think more market cap is going to go to equities. That's what I would pick.
Okay.
They might moderate, but yeah.
Thanks, Laurie. So, I mean, a question for both of you, and we can probably go to Bryan first. There's been a huge amount of chatter around Australian recovery versus the New Zealand recovery. What are your thoughts on that?
I've been thinking a lot about it lately, in particular because I've got clients in New Zealand that have postponed work I was going to do with them until I could do it in person. So, yeah, exactly was going through my mind. And so to have New Zealand with no community transmission of the virus, and we've still got some, and we look like we're getting on top of it. But then in Beijing this morning, I hear they're shutting down schools and universities again because there's an outbreak. Does New Zealand open up or does it not? And I'm thinking to myself, well, as those stats on 8.4% of the workforce in tourism, can New Zealand afford not to open up? And how long can it go without a tourism industry? I don't know the answer to that. In terms of recovery here, things have not got as bad as predicted, from what I can tell. The government's stimulus package didn't turn out to be near as big as they thought it was going to be. Unemployment, you know, I heard the other day hit 8-something%. Like, well, that wasn't so terrible all that long ago. You know, we're hope, you know, so there's a lot of positive things are opening up in terms of younger people. I'm associated. Well, my daughter works in retail. Seems like we didn't sit on the cash as much over here when people got the money in the bank account and they went, retail's still open and I can go buy some clothes. Why not? Certainly the hospital, you know, the restaurants and things, but their restaurants are renovating. You know, my son works at one and they're renovating, looking to open up a Michelin hat restaurant. So in terms of recovery, you know, we've got mining, we've got our problems with China and the trade impacts that are coming with, was barley and then meat, and tertiary education, my goodness. Yeah, so we've got a lot of long-term impacts, and from what I can tell, and again, not the expert, there's a view that we're going to steam ahead and roll the dice so that we can keep it under control.
Laurie, would you like to add something to that?
Oh, I'd endorse it. Look, I think the numbers of fatalities between Australia and New Zealand pretty close. The numbers of cases also pretty close. The big difference is the cost of the response, which was much lower in Australia than it was in New Zealand, and that really reflects the relative harshness and lateness actually of our response. We went hard because we went, you know, quite late in the piece, and you know, so because they haven't destroyed as much, it's easier for the Australians to recover. And the responses to the COVID threat were different state by state. So some states did better than others. I mean, poor old Bryan, I think New South Wales, I think you had it hardest on all fronts. But if you look at Queensland and Tasmania, they seem to have quite a good low touch but effective response. Whereas here in New Zealand, we had one size fits all, and it was a real clampdown. So yeah, so I mean, we have run some numbers at the Institute on, you know, how we stand relative to Australia and the Aussies. It's hard to see any reason why they wouldn't come back a lot quicker and stronger than we will here. And that's largely, I said it was all about the response, all about the lockdown response. That's the fundamental reason why theirs was not, and they were stronger beforehand, I suppose you would have to say. It's, you know, it's a large, diverse economic engine that you have over there, you know, and sometimes that really pays off. So I'd just support what Bryan said there.
Okay. Yeah, and just on that, in terms of what we chose to shut down, not shut down, when, you know, people over here discussing, should we be shutting down harder like New Zealand and things? And one of the things I heard a lot, you're going to shut down the oil and gas industry and the mining industry and all those things right now. And, you know, and we're a big country where there was not necessarily any virus in those parts of the world. Like it was, as I was saying, I don't know how many times I've said it over the last few months, I pity senior decision makers on this planet in recent times. Very, very tough decisions. So I don't point the finger at any of them.
Okay. And just leading on from that, I mean, the question for Laurie here that's come up, my understanding is that the NZ government debt was quite low by world standards. So is it really an issue that is now much higher? Or have we just caught up where the rest of the world was and can manage it in a similar way to how other countries were?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. Yes, we were low. So the prehistory is before the earthquakes, we were even below 20% of GDP as the debt that we were carrying. I can't remember it as low what the absolute floor was, but it was either 19% or 17%, but it was in that range, right? It was 20 or below. Then the earthquakes came along. We had to leverage up to pay for those, so that ticked us up to the sort of upper 20s, and there've been some increases in recent years. So we've been knocking around that level. You know, so our starting point is still, you know, even at 30%, it's low by world standards. If you think, you know, I'm going to forget the numbers, but you can probably go on Wikipedia and get a very good, easy to manipulate table of these. But Japan is unbelievably high. It's, you know, it's some multiple of GDP. I think it's about 3 times GDP. a lot of the European nations were close to 100% of GDP. So even on the sort of numbers that we're talking about in response to COVID, you could argue that we're only beginning to approach those European levels. That's one thing you could say. But it was a great advantage to us here in New Zealand that our GDP to debt was so low. You know, that we didn't have that albatross hanging around our necks of all this borrowing that the taxpayer had to service all the time. You know, we're a small economy, we're a trading economy. We're, you know, exposed to the volatility of world markets in so many different ways. You know, having very low gearing on the Crown balance sheet was actually a terrific advantage to that, and a terrific advantage to the people of New Zealand, and that they didn't have to service that. So we're moving out of that world. So we go up to, let's use the government numbers. Let's say we go up to 54% of GDP in 2023. Okay, what about the next earthquake? What do we do then?
Okay, great. And then, I mean, just one last one for Bryan going on from there, and then we'll wrap up with one final question for both panelists. Bryan, what do you think the defining differences between leadership style in a small business as opposed to large businesses, with New Zealand, a country that, you know, is built on SME businesses?
Mm-hmm. Not nearly as qualified as a Harvard professor to answer this. There's a personal view that, look, we all like to feel a bit special. And as small business leader, I want to feel special because, as a big leader, I want to feel special because, in truth, very similar skills apply in both. And it's just having the nous of know when to be more big business leader and when to be more small business leader. So even in small business, you need to be big picture from time to time. You can't just be leading the troops in the trenches, particularly as your business gets bigger. But you've got to be there in small business. You've got to know how things work, and you've got to do your best. So look, I don't think there is any fundamental difference other than in big business, you stay out of the trenches more. In small business, you get in a bit more, but you need all those things. You need to be able to influence people, from staff to customers to suppliers. You need to have a lot of emotional intelligence to know when staff are well and when they're not. You need to be a thinker around strategy. Just to sit still and rest on your laurels of what worked this year and not think about what next year and, you know, the 3 to 5 years, right now, the 3 to 5 months. I think we all want to be a little bit special, but I don't think there's any fundamental difference. I think a great leader will do well in both.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, I think to round it up now in terms of, you know, this Q&A session, one last sort of question, obviously taking into account some of the things that have been going on in Europe and countries like Sweden. One of the attendees have asked, you know, have we in both countries, but particularly here in NZ, overpriced the risk of letting COVID run naturally at the cost of the economy?
Who's first?
Laurie.
Laurie.
Look, personal view, not the view of the Institute, yes. My preference would have been a risk-based approach, which looks something like, this is the population that's at risk. So it's not me, it's older people, it's, you know, it's people with pre-existing conditions, and we work out how we put a cordon sanitaire around those risk clusters, if we can call them that, and we keep as much of the rest of the economic machine running as we can. That would have been my preference. We didn't do that. So that, to the question, that says we did overprice the risk of COVID, because we shut down a lot of the economy. We deemed it, the government deemed it worthwhile to shut down a lot of the economy because they thought that was better than allowing more of the economy to continue to operate and taking the risk of more cases and potentially more fatalities. So in my view, we did. I think if we look across the world, in the next few months, it's probably started already, but there will be after action reviews of one kind or another taking place, including, I hope, here in New Zealand. where we look at honestly, you know, what didn't work out the way we would have wanted or expected. And what I would expect to see from those is exactly this point. Actually, we took because, you know, what we did in New Zealand is, it's different in degree to what happened in other parts of the world, but it's not different in its nature to what happened in other parts of the world. It was a pretty commonly agreed recipe that was followed here and in Europe, and you know, the outlier countries are in Eastern Europe and East Asia, and they did things differently to us, but we followed the script. And I think that script didn't really think hard enough about risk, the characteristics of risk, and what the opportunity costs of what we've done really are. So I don't know who the questioner was, but that's a good question, and I think we did take a wrong view of the risk there.
Okay. Bryan, do you want to add your bit?
Yeah, sure. I had the opportunity to reach out to a number of emergency services clients as this happened, and offered to help them pro bono, which was the right thing to do. I think a lot of us did those types of things. And one was the police force, and I was trying to get them an estimate, because they couldn't get estimates from anyone they thought of an authority on where this caseload was going to go, and what their role was going to be, and what they had to, well, they had no idea what their role might be, but they had no idea of demand. So they tried to get an idea of demand. And at the end, when I looked at some key things, like comparing Italy to us, one of the big things was the rate of testing and the rate of positive tests. Italy was like 15% positive rate. We were like 1% positive rate. And so it was already more widely spread there. And so when I did the numbers and gave them to the police, I said, well, it doesn't look like it's going to get that bad to me. And so I was, because of that work I did, I was speaking to a lot of people about saying, let's not overcook this. Yes. And I was also on the phones to health, people in the health sector, and they're going, we're ramping up. We're ready. I don't think we're going to get overwhelmed. Now, that's all easy to say, as I said before. I'm not pointing any fingers at anyone. When you saw the pictures coming out of Italy, why could we be any bit different to Italy, Australia, New Zealand? Well, fortunate enough, we're far enough away that it came a bit later. We had people that could act, and we got talented people across healthcare, emergency services, and fortunately, while we've got a money problem, we didn't have that extreme hurt from the pain that could have come. So wish us all the best in digging our way out of it and getting back to where we can be.
Absolutely. Bryan, Laurie, thank you so much for your insights today. And we really appreciate your responses to some rather curly questions from our audience. So I hope that's not put you on the spot too much. This has been recorded. It will be available on LinkedIn. Otherwise, all have a great day, and I'm sure we'll all be in touch soon. Thanks so much, guys.
Cheers.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.